For nearly 30 years, Comics Connection has served as central Pennsylvania's pop culture mecca, with locations in York and Mechanicsburg. But now, you don't have to live in Pennsylvania to shop there. The brand new Comics Connection online store features a wide variety of back issues, graphic novels, games, and much more. Find out why thousands of customers, including such celebrities as Mike Hawthorne, J.F. Gonzalez, Mary SanGiovanni, and Brian Keene, have made Comics Connection their #1 store to shop at over the years. Check out the new online store at comicsconnection.com. That's COMIX connection.com.
That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons a podcast shall rise. H.P. Lovecraft, Weird Tales, Ramsey Campbell, Cthulhu, Laird Barron, Silent Hill, Brian Lumley, Dagon. There's something sinister out there in the cosmos, and the tendrils run deep throughout the universe. Only one woman dares to traverse the web. Mary SanGiovanni, who once again is up to cosmic shenanigans.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to Cosmic Shenanigans. This is Mary SanGiovanni, and I'm up to a new kind of shenanigans, of course, of cosmic proportions. This week, we have author Lucas Milliron. He's written Tim E. Less, The Becoming, actually it's just Becoming, The Chattering, and some other books, which I'm not even sure we can mention on the network. And we're going to try something new this week. We're going to have Lucas, welcome to the show.
Hello.
We're going to have Lucas talk about Clive Barker's works and make a compelling argument for them to be considered cosmic horror. So,
Indeed.
Lucas, tell me first what you think are the absolute important elements of a cosmic horror work.
Well, it's basically, the main thing is that you have otherworldly dimensions that can leak in between our world and their world. Mm-hmm. You have to have some kind of cult element. You have to have something weird and crazy. And there has to be that element of insanity.
Okay.
And I would highly emphasize that Clive Barker's work, especially The Hellbound Heart, meets all those criteria.
I can see that. Okay. Tell me about it.
So, not to compare it to the movie, because the movie's vastly different than the book, as they usually are. Mm. In the book, you have Kirsty, who's actually part of a romantic triangle, where she's kind of the third wheel. She didn't get to Rory in time before he fell in love with Julia. Julia, meanwhile, was in love with Frank Cotton, which is Rory's brother. So there's this huge love thing going on. But what makes it more cosmic is the fact that you have the lament configuration, you have the Cenobites, and let's not forget that a Cenobite is actually a religious figure. Cthulhu could be very much argued to be a Cenobite for the Elder Gods, if you look at it in that way, because he is the sleeping priest. Mm-hmm. As far as the Hellraiser aspect or the Hellbound Heart goes, you have Frank, who finds a box from a degenerate out in the middle of Asia. He has very little information about it. You can't find any information about it. The puzzle is designed by a Frenchman who also designs bird boxes and song music boxes. And when Frank solves it, he summons these entities from another dimension. Where the movie kind of veers from the book again is that the entities in the book aren't necessarily demons. They're actually beings from another dimension who have grown tired of what we have to offer in the world of life, death, and flesh. Mm-hmm. So they're actually looking to explore and learn new types of stimulation. And in their case, it's just very sexualized. So the madness comes when Frank realizes that the offer that he was given was Well, let's take it back. He opens the box because he himself has grown tired of trials, tribulations, and just all the pleasures that he's found of this world. He's grown bored with it. It's repetition. It's the same old, same old. So when he opens the box, they say, oh, well, you'll get pleasures unabound, things that you could never even dream of in your wildest imagination or your darkest fantasy. What he fails to realize is that one person's definition of pleasure doesn't always line up with everybody else. That's where the madness lies. Because when the first thing they do in the book when they abduct Frank Cotton is they hypersensitize his entire body. He can feel every fiber in his shirt against his skin. He can taste all the foul, wretched odors in the air from a jar of piss and excrement that he saved to add as an offering for the Cenobites as a form of self-defilement. Mm-hmm. He could he could see things like all the details in a feather. He sees all the little fibers and all the dust mites on it staring, grinning at him, laughing at him. He can hear all the noises in the room and beyond. And then he starts seeing things and tasting things, like he tastes a piece of beef in his teeth from dinner the night before. And all these hypersensitivities attack him and assault him before he's then bombarded with thoughts and memories of his past escapades where he was, defiling women and other people, and just all those things so overwhelming that he is so entrenched with all this stimulus, he ends up just masturbating because he has nothing left to do. He's lost his mind and he's lost everything.
Right.
And then the Cenobites come and take him away. That's when he meets the engineer. So there's lots of room to say, yeah, this is cosmic horror. It's not Cthulhu, but there is madness. There is this underlying element of the other. And that's a huge thing, is that fear of the unknown, or that fear of we think we know something, but it's not universal.
And that quest for knowledge beyond once the human experience ceases to have any real significance. That's definitely, and I hadn't thought about that too, that Frank is basically looking for forbidden knowledge. Mm-hmm. And when he finds it, it drives him insane.
Oh yeah. And there is very little more forbidden than sexual taboo.
Right.
It's just Clive Barker has a unique body horror spin on it, because one of Clive Barker's greatest fears was basically being degloved, having your skin peeled off. That was one of his biggest, cringy things, which is why when you read a lot of Clive Barker or you look at a lot of his movies, you see a lot of that. You see people that are peeled open, skin removed, and just all the muscular detail, because he thought that was terrifying.
Right. And there's something we've talked about in past episodes of Cosmic Shenanigans, that cosmic horror is not often associated with, I think, any kind of body horror, but it's there. It's there maybe more subtly than more extreme types of horror, but it definitely is there because there's an element that the human body is that you lose control of your own body, that it becomes something pliable and something that is basically the clay or the plaything of a force stronger than you, and that's both physical and mental, and and emotional and spiritual. In every way, you become changeable, pliable, malleable to whatever forces are out there.
Well, consider the movie The Thing, which hands down cosmic horror, right?
Right.
Well, that's body horror. I mean, when you think about the creatures that are taking you over, that are taking on your persona and are changing your body. I mean, the idea is that we have your body is your temple. But how do you save the invading forces? What do you do to keep them out? And if your body is your temple, there's religious connotation to that. And if the people taking it over are some sort of cult or some sort of entity beyond this realm, what do you do?
That's true. I mean, I guess in the Hellbound Heart, you could say that the Cenobites are both gods and a kind of cult in and of themselves. Exactly. That they serve both purposes, really, because Now, here's a question, and I know this is going to sound incredibly, embarrassingly naive. In the books, because I know that this is something that they cover in the movies. In the movies, they say that the Cenobites were once human beings, but they were human beings that had actually ascended to a point where, rather than maybe go insane or somehow become sort of tortured souls of the lament configuration, that they had ascended to become, I guess, priests of this particular worldview. And although they were changed, perhaps irrevocably changed, they still had essentially human origins. I didn't get that impression when I read the book. Is that true in the book, or were they always entities of another dimension?
So as far as like Clive Barker's body of work, he said he never really gone into specifics as to whether or not they were human at one point. He hints it in the Scarlet Gospels when Pinhead is talking to another Cenobite or talking of another Cenobite. As far as like Pinhead was never actually called Pinhead in the book. In fact, the Pinhead character was called the Black Priest or the Dark Priest.
Okay.
And the main person who was in charge of all of the Cenobites was called the Engineer. So as far as turning them into Cenobites, I can say that was mostly the film adaptations, but not so much Clive Barker. Now, the universe of Hellraiser completely changed when they went into the comic book series. And that totally changed a lot of the mythos, and they tweaked and added some stuff. And I kind of got into the comic books, but some of them just got a little bit weird. I was more into the oh my god, I forgot the name of it. The Harbinger series, basically, where they were people trying to go into hell and save people from hell from the Cenobites.
Okay.
But again, that's not necessarily canon. For the purpose of the literary part, I would just say no. I don't think the Cenobites directly were human, although they could have been.
I also got the impression, too, because you mentioned hell, that hell was something that was kind of only mentioned in the movies, that the Cenobites didn't refer to or think of their dimension of origin, I guess, as hell per se. That it was because there's a strong blurring, I think, between what would be considered heaven and what would be considered hell. Yeah. That it was really an alternate dimension of experiences. And that's kind of how it just, solely existed as another place that, in essence, because I think a strong aspect of cosmic horror is this idea of human insignificance. There is sort of an underlying idea that the human experience, all of the things that we think make being human important in any way, at some point sort of cease to have any real meaning or importance. And that even the body, the body and the soul, and how we interpret things, really, because, the body sends messages, physical messages of what we're perceiving to the brain. But a lot of our interpretation of that, is exactly how the brain processes it. That all of these things, though, cease to have any real importance if you can find a way to go beyond it.
Well, that was one of the reasons I fell in love with cosmic fiction to begin with. It's because it's a very existential outlook on the universe itself.
Right.
And in the book, all the Cenobites were just humans or beings that were so jaded with existence, jaded from having experienced everything that the body can handle. Because when you're talking about sexual desire, when you're talking about, things like BDSM or modern primitivism, where people practice scarification and body modification, you are limited to the extent of what the flesh can tolerate. And the worst possible thing that can happen is death. The Cenobites, knowing this, found this alternate dimension where essentially death is no longer an option. Death has been taken out of the equation. So now all you're left with are creatures who can experiment and try as many different things with sensory play that you couldn't even imagine.
Right.
And that adds to that sort of shapeless nature that you get in cosmic horror, because you never see the beings. But in this case, you do see the beings. Not only do you see them, but Barker, very much so in the film adaptation and in the books, didn't hide his monsters. He purposely bathed them in light. He wanted you to see every inch of their scarred and tattered flesh. So that way, your imagination, your shapeless wonder is, well, what the fuck did that?
Yes. And what would drive a person to that? You know?
Oh, yeah. And that gives you that, again, that shapeless nature. And to go back to the existential part of it, I mean, in optometry and opticianry, which is what I do for my day job, is make and sell eyeglasses. You are constantly reminded that we are just a series of brain signals, that the only thing we see, that color isn't actually color. Color is wavelengths that hit your eyes. And all the colors that you see, that object isn't actually red. That object isn't actually blue or purple. What you're looking at is the reflection of those wavelengths bouncing off of that object, hitting your brain, sending chemical reactions that your body and mind interpretate. So your conscious experience is different just from someone who can see color versus someone who can't see color, who's color deficient. So if you're looking at how the existential nature of things are, what about creatures who don't necessarily live in a world of light?
Right.
So vision is no longer an issue. Sleeping is no longer an issue. If you live in a world sequestered in total darkness, which the Cenobites are in the book, or say Cthulhu, or say Asimov, who lives out in space, if all you live in is perpetual darkness, you can no longer tell the difference between waking and sleeping. Therefore, you can no longer tell the difference between dreaming and wakefulness. And if your subconscious is powerful enough, you can manipulate those realities into one. So that way Cthulhu is lying, sleeping, dreaming, waiting.
Right.
And again, it's all just because everything is relative. Everything is based on certain stimulations, and it's all just a chemical reaction.
I think that's interesting. Like, you bring up a good point that because I think this is a strong aspect of cosmic horror, and maybe it's emphasized more in modern cosmic horror than perhaps in traditional cosmic horror, that perception is a huge defining factor in reality. I think that in other approaches to fiction, maybe not so much in horror, but in other approaches to fiction, I think reality is often considered an objective thing.
Very much.
But in horror, a lot of times, and especially I think in cosmic horror, reality and sanity are subjective, or at the very least are fluid enough that perspective can cause them to change. And one of the things that we fear is that loss of structure, that loss of objectivity. And we fear any entity that can, I guess, maybe fearlessly make that leap.
Obvious.
And manipulate our sense of reality, because we find a certain comfort and security, like children do, in structure,
Well,
and especially I think in Clive Barker's work in general.
Oh yeah. You have,
there is no structure, there's no structure there's not even a structure to the human body anymore.
No, like take his work, the movie Lord of Illusions.
Right.
Lord of Illusions is straight up cosmic horror. If you
That's the one with the djinn, right? The one with the djinn?
That's the one with the magician.
Oh, right. Okay, I'm sorry.
That's the magician.
I always confuse them. I know which one. That's the one with the cult.
Yes.
Based on the magician. Yes.
Based on the magician. So what makes the original sorcerer, the guy who runs and basically controls the cult, what makes him so evil, so vile, and what I think made the movie way ahead of its time was that the guy shows I can't even remember the character's name. It's been so long since I've seen it. But the guy shows the magician the actual, what reality is. He literally peels back flesh. He peels back reality and exposes the universe for its ugly nakedness that it really is. Mm-hmm. And anybody who gazes too long upon that, that chaos, that void, becomes consumed by it. And that's essentially what cosmic horror is realizing how insignificant, realizing how little our bags of meat really matter. Mm-hmm. Because flesh is super subjective. It's all about consciousness. And when you're talking about shapeless beings, they don't care what flesh looks like. All they care about is subconscious because, again, they're waking and dreaming. They're in a reality where visual cues don't matter as much as other sensory and auditory responses.
Right.
So
there's a definite sense of, and you mentioned too, a definite sense of chaos.
Exactly.
That we don't, because, and I think it is, like you said, because our entire understanding of the world around us, our entire understanding of who we are is based in sensory analysis, I guess, what we're perceiving based on the senses that we have. That's how we know that we are. That's how we know that others exist. That's how we know that, this is what is happening. And there is a certain structure to that I think, a certain order that when that breaks down, it causes panic, it causes anxiety, it's chaos that perhaps human beings are not
ready for,
designed to accept and function in.
No, our greatest strength and weakness is sight. Visual cues is one of the things that has brought mankind to where we are today. But the problem is our reliance on visual stimulation over almost any other sensory part of our body is what makes cosmic horror so utterly terrifying. Because if you can't see it, what it can be, what it can do is far worse than anything you can imagine.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
Take, for example, in my field. One of the first things we tell parents, especially if their children are a little bit ADD, let's say, it's not necessarily because the child is clinically ADD. It might not be that. 9 times out of 10, maybe not 9 times out of 10, but a good portion of the time, I would say, a lot of those behavioral problems can be corrected with eyeglasses because the child feels left out, because the child doesn't know what's happening around him. So he then has to create his own little pocket universe outside of everything else. So if you take something like that, a person's own conscious little pocket universe that everybody is living in their own little bubble based on what they can see, and you can change it slightly by making lines sharper and colors brighter, imagine what else can be changed. And kids don't know any better. Children have no idea that they can't see because these are the eyes they've had their entire life. This is what they've been brought up with. And it's not until all the people around them are saying, well, I can see that, why can't you? That now all of a sudden they're different, they're alien, something about them has changed. And that's where a lot of people are reluctant to wear eyeglasses, because now you're changing not that things are better or worse or the same. You're telling them that everything they see is wrong.
Which makes them feel like the other.
Exactly. And that's part of why cosmic horror, I think, at least in my industry, makes such a huge difference for me. Because everybody fears it.
That's fascinating, because I was going to ask you if you come in contact with people who for them the visual component of life is somehow hampered. Do they comfortably adjust to interpreting their world in other ways? Like I noticed that because I have terrible vision, so without my contacts, I'm nearsighted, so I can see things close, but I can't see things far away. But I've noticed that I don't seem to hear as well if I don't have my contacts in and I'm talking to somebody, because I read lips. I think we all do. We all do as a natural thing. And when I can't see their mouth moving, I can't interpret the sounds that I would hear. I mean, normally, because the volume hasn't changed, but I think we combine so many things together in order to create a perspective on what we're, but it's interesting that you bring that, that you mentioned that's how the children don't seem to see any difference because they wouldn't have anything to compare it to. They don't have anybody saying to them, no, you should be seeing it this way,
And we don't like our brain to be told it's wrong, whether it's someone looking at a magic trick. You have some people that are very adverse to it because they don't like to be lied to. Mm-hmm. You have some people who look at magic and be like, well, I need to dissect this and understand how this works because, again, you don't like being lied to. Glasses are not much different than a magic trick because we're basically saying everything you see right now could be enhanced. We don't ever say that, well, you don't see that big letter E because your eyes are bad. We say we can enhance your vision to better see the letter E. Because if you just put on a pair of glasses to somebody with a really strong prescription and they've never worn glasses before, usually they reject that prescription. They flat out say, I don't like it. Everything's wrong. I have headaches because the mind can't tolerate change, or it can only tolerate a certain amount of change. So if we are so fragile that a pair of eyeglasses can break down our head and give us headaches, give us ocular migraines, give us all these little things, what happens when we are faced with something cosmic, where our physical, auditory, touch, smell, all of those sensory organs are being told everything you know and see is false? That there is a fourth dimension. There is a fifth or sixth way of seeing and experiencing the universe. And Clive Barker does that in Hellraiser. He does that in Weave World in some ways. He loves exploring those little things. One of his favorite writers was Lovecraft. I mean, he was heavily inspired by it. And when you look at some of his wordy prose, when you look at some of his poetic nature, there's very much a Lovecraft inspiration from there.
It's interesting what he takes from it. I think he takes he takes the magic of it. Exactly. He takes the magic of what Lovecraft strove, I think, especially in the later part of his career, to solidify by science. And I think Clive Barker, takes the magical aspect of that and runs with it. And it's interesting what he does change, like the fact that there is such an overtly sexual overtones in Clive Barker's work, which I think Lovecraft did have undertones of
definitely
sexual of sexuality and sexual perversion, which I think he would have been horrified to realize was perhaps as obvious as it is. But it goes back again to the idea of body horror, that one of the greatest expressions of and explorations of physicality is sex. So that I think that when sexuality is distorted, it's the same idea. It's like, here's a reality which could exist in our physical perception of the world that maybe we don't want to see. And the other thing, like you said earlier, is that he doesn't hide the monsters. There's no that which cannot be described. Everything is very much that which can be described because it becomes a very sensory thing. One of the things I think that people don't mention much in Lovecraft's work is that while the visuals are often like, I can't even describe what this was like because it was so, foreign. There's always very strong sense of smell.
Yes.
And a very strong sense of sound. So there still is very much, I think, a physical
playing the senses. Yes.
And I think, like I said, I think Clive Barker tries to find, the brightest colors and the strongest smells and
well, I think a lot of that has to do with him exploring his own sexuality. Because his first book was the Damnation Game. And with that book, it's told from a straight guy's perspective, but he wrote it when he was exploring becoming, him coming out of the closet as a homosexual.
Right.
And when you look at a lot of the Cenobites, they're considered sexless creatures.
Yes.
Pinhead has actually got a very feminine voice. The only creature that was ever given a gender specifically was the engineer. The engineer was woman. When you first meet the engineer in The Hellbound Heart, when Frank has already done masturbating, expelling his seed on the floor, and he's just lying there, a blithering, crying pulp of man on the floor. And then all of a sudden he is presented with this very strong woman figure. She's very sexualized. She has curves. She has firm breasts. She's completely naked from head to toe, except for a necklace adorned with human mummified tongues that he describes as slugs, looking as if they're trying to lap and lick her genitalia. And a lot of that, I think, too, has to do with a person who wasn't necessarily comfortable with their sexuality yet, who was a person still exploring that. And when you look at a lot of Lovecraft stuff, his was a story of repression. And I think that's why he wasn't necessarily as overt with his sexuality and overt with his descriptions. I think it was a shyness to it, especially a shyness to the opposite sex. With Barker, he wasn't just embracing it, he was exploring it. He was in the middle of the modern BDSM movement before it became BDSM as we know it. When the Hellbound Heart was out, it was still called the modern primitive movement. And that was just people who were Westerners who were practicing Eastern traditions of scarification, needle play, those spiritual rituals where people would stick daggers and knives in their skin and their face and walk around with headdresses made entirely of pins and needles stuck into the flesh. And what he found about that was there was a spiritual awakening that people would get from all this pain and blood loss. And when you're experimenting that sexually, and you're experimenting that especially as a homosexual coming out of the closet, or anybody exploring and being confident with their sexuality, well, hey, pride is a very colorful rainbow. And so is most of Clive Barker's fiction.
You bring up a good point that, in cosmic horror, as we said before, there's a sense of becoming, a sense of change that either, the body undergoes or the mind undergoes or the spirit undergoes, a sense of, and this was actually, it was overt in at least two of Lovecraft stories that I can think of. The Outsider and probably The Shadows over Innismouth.
Yes.
Where there's an idea of embracing who you are, even if it's considered monstrous by other people. That this idea of change and of finally discovering where you belong in the grand scheme of the universe. And I think that like Clive Barker does that, in spades, really.
I think Lovecraft did that on accident, to be honest.
Maybe.
I mean, because if you look at his personality, you look at all of the way he was writing it, I don't think, especially Shadow over Innsmouth was supposed to be a happy ending. I think for the time, the way he wrote it was a tragedy that this person was embracing that darker aspect of it. He intended it to be negative because, again, he was xenophobic, he was racist, he was anti-Semitic. And here you have a guy who says, well, I guess I got no other choice. I might as well embrace it. And
sort of almost like a suicide of humanity, of his own humanity. Yeah,
exactly. And now that we have our 2020 lenses on, now that we're looking at it with our modern perspective, we look at that as actually a happy ending. We look at that as normal. I mean, look at Clive Barker's work. He wrote a book called Cabal that became a movie called Nightbreed.
One of my favorites.
The original cut of Nightbreed was completely butchered by the studio because at the time in the early 80s or the late 80s when it was being made, the studio said monsters are not allowed to be the good guy. All monsters have to be the villain. All monsters have to be evil. Now, here's Clive Barker, a homosexual, who identifies with the other, who identifies more with the monsters.
Right.
Because all of the villains in Nightbreed were the humans. Every single one of them. Whether it was the sheriff, whether it was Decker, all of them were the villain, except for the woman. Which is another thing that I've noticed in a lot of Clive Barker's thing, is he actually very much turns a lot of the female characters into the heroines. Very rarely do you see a female character in a Barker work who isn't strong, who isn't independent, who isn't very smart and outspoken, and usually survives at the end. I say usually because obviously there's exceptions to the rule.
Right.
But no, I mean, when you look especially at Cabal or when you look at Nightbreed, it took them all this time to re-edit the movie, repackage it to the way that it's supposed to be. And if you like the original cut, look at the modern director's cut, the first director's cut, because now they're getting a little weird with all the found footage they have. But when they released it with the Blu-ray edition, they added all the pieces that were missing to actually give you the fact that you're supposed to sympathize with the monsters.
Right.
I mean, especially when you have like, what was her name? Claudia, the woman who could shapeshift and was burned by the light. The first time you meet her was when the girl is walking through the cemetery, walking through the upper floors of Midian. And then you see this creature smoldering on the ground, and she picks it up, and it's got those large, beautiful eyes and that wicked, slick skin that's glistening and beautifully macabre. And you can't help but cry for the creature because it's suffering.
Right.
And then she brings it in, and that's where you find that humanity isn't skin deep. Humanity is what's underneath.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have people as we are now who don't see humanity but for face value, because we are so reliant on sight, because we're so reliant on what we see, we can't see what's underneath. And again, that goes back to what makes cosmic horror so wonderful, is that we're peeling back the layers and looking at something awful, something distressing.
Mm-hmm.
Clive Barker wrote a story where the horror is actually within humanity. It's not the other. It's us. We're the problem.
Right. And I like that. I like the versatility of cosmic horror and the fact that a lot of modern cosmic horror takes what could be considered flaws in the way Lovecraft approached it and fixes them, or does something new and different with them. So anyway, thank you very much, Lucas, for what I think is an absolutely compelling argument for Clive Barker's work to be cosmic horror. I hadn't really thought of it in a lot of ways that you brought it up. That's awesome. So thank you very much for being on the show.
Oh, no problem. I really appreciate coming on.
And I like to remind readers that if you want to pick up some of Lucas's books, where should they go, Lucas, to get the best and brightest of what you've got?
So if you're looking for my more cosmic-y-ish work, right now I've got Timmy Less, which has a lot of cosmic influences. The Becoming series has a lot of cosmic influences there as well. All of that is found on Amazon. I do have a book through Grindhouse, which may not necessarily be cosmic horror, but it is definitely extreme. That is a book called Cocksucker. Again, also found on Amazon and Grindhouse Press. You can look me up on Instagram. You can look me up on Twitter. Instagram is Milliron Lucas, my last name, first name. And Twitter is Bearded Optician.
Wonderful. Well, this was really a lot of fun. So thank you so much. Folks, if you want to hear more episodes of Cosmic Horror, you can check out the Brian Keene Radio Network. If you go to briankeene.com and click on Radio Podcasts, they're all there. They're also on YouTube. Past, present, and future, all are one on YouTube. And I'd like to offer a special congratulations to Aiden Osario, who won the free download of Usman Malik's In the Ruins of Mohenjo-Daro from Serial Box. That's SERIALBOX. We're very excited for you, and I hope you really enjoy the story. And thanks again for the great suggestion. I really appreciate it. If you would like to advertise on Cosmic Shenanigans, you can contact our engineer, Matt Wilderson, through that site as well. So again, thank you to Lucas for being on the show, and we'll see you all next week.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.
Cosmic Shenanigans is a production of the Brian Keene Radio Network. You can listen to this episode and all previous episodes for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, Google Play Music, and wherever else podcasts are available. Cosmic Shenanigans is written and produced by Mary SanGiovanni. Our theme music is by Xander Harris. Our engineer is Matt Wilderson. Check out his books on Amazon.com. If you enjoyed this show, you might enjoy our other podcasts, The Horror Show with Brian Keene, Defenders Dialogue, and Grindcast. To advertise on Cosmic Shenanigans, visit briankeene.com and click Podcasts.